Okay, so let's talk a little bit about fungus. If I can get this to come up. All right. So this opening picture has two pictures of reproductive structures of fungus, and then one scanning electron micrograph of microscopic single-celled fungus. And so we'll sort of see that there are both single-cellular and multicellular fungus. Probably some of the largest organisms in the world are fungus, and yet they also exist as single-celled structures. So we have this kind of huge spread in size, and we definitely have this unanswerable question about what is an individual when we get to fungus. Like, right? I don't know. I don't know that we can answer that question. So we'll start by talking a little bit about what the characteristics of fungus are, and then we'll talk about the ecology. I'm going to leave these things out. You interact with fungal parasites and pathogens and understand their importance in your daily life. Hopefully to some extent, and if not, you guys are welcome to read those sections. So I want to start with just defining what a fungus is. This picture here shows you a lot of really diverse looking organisms, many different colors, sizes, shapes, right? But obviously, like all of the groups we've looked at, there are some underlying things. And fungus is an entire kingdom. So when we've been going through some of the other groups, we've been looking at phylums or orders or classes, and this is a whole kingdom. So to put a broad brush over it, these guys are all heterotrophic eukaryotes. So heterotrophic means what? Quick review. They consume the things, right? They have to eat their nutrients, bring their nutrients into their body from another source. Mostly their source of carbon and energy is outside. It's usually the underlying definition of that. And they're going to acquire their nutrients via absorption. So instead of actually ingesting things, they're going to absorb broken down molecules. And they're going to actually do the digestion outside of their body. Okay. If any of you have been noticing, I didn't see any when we were in the woods on Tuesday, but if you guys walk around in the GCC forest, you will eventually come across some brilliant teal green coloration on downed wood, right? And that's actually something related to this guy up here. It's called blue stain, and it's a fungus, and you'll just see this blue, bright, it's just really vibrant and brilliant color on the wood, and that's actually the fungal vegetation growing in that wood. And then it does fruit, and it has these little tiny, very small little mushrooms that pop up when that happens. Okay, I'm going to have this very broad tree of fungal relationships, mostly because I think for a really long time, fungus was considered to be like plants, was thought to be plant-like. And although it produces spores like plants do, it's really very different from plants. Although there are some similarities, but the biggest difference in terms of how they get nutrients. They don't have any of the photosynthetic pigments. They don't carry out photosynthesis. They're going to have to bring their nutrients into their body as heterotrophs. So fungus sort of goes off on this branch over here, and this branch over here leads to animals and these single-celled or colonial organisms that are kind of sponge-like in their body shape. But we're more closely related to fungus as animals than the plants are. Oh, and another thing to point out here is that fungus have chitin in their cell walls. Does anybody remember what chitin is? What is chitin? Okay. It's not keratinization. It's not mineralized. It's a carbohydrate. It's one of our carbohydrates. And so it's a long chain of glucose that has nitrogen groups added to it. It is what makes the skeletons of arthropods crunchy. So the thing that makes a bug go crunch, like when you step on a cockroach, that's chitin. And so that chitin that is the exoskeleton of arthropods is also in the cell walls providing reinforcement for fungus. So just some broad characteristics. Most of the fungus is multicellular. Not all of it, but the majority of it is multicellular. Also, the majority is capable of reproducing either asexually or sexually. And as with many organisms, asexual reproduction is the rule, and sexual reproduction usually comes into play when the environment is unpredictable or when environmental conditions start to get sketchy and you want to hedge your bets against the future. Okay. So I already just mentioned the cell wall is composed of chitin. And then, like, as a group, most fungus are obligate aerobic organisms. So that means that they use oxygen for cellular respiration. Some of them, though, are facultative anaerobes. So when we talked about rumens, we talked about the fermentation vats in the rumen of our vertebrate animals, in the rumen mammals. Those fermentation organisms are facultative anaerobic fungus. Some of them are. There's also some anaerobic bacteria in there. Then some of them are, I'm sorry, those are obligate anaerobes in the rumen. And then some are facultative anaerobes, which means that they can go anaerobic if they're deprived of oxygen, but they would typically use oxygen. Okay, so we have the whole gamut again, lots of diversity. You'll hear this term associated with fungus a lot if you start reading about them, the thallus. The thallus refers to either the unicellular or multicellular vegetative portion of the body of a fungus. So when you see out in the forest a mushroom, if that's sort of what we associate the most with fungus, that's actually the reproductive structure. It's not the vegetative structure. It's not the feeding structure. And so that's a specialized structure for reproduction. Most of the time when we're looking at the body of the fungus, we're looking at the vegetative body, or the thallus. Okay. We use the term yeast to refer to unicellular fungus. There are many genera of unicellular fungus. You're probably most familiar with the yeast that you use for baking, but there are also some candida is a common yeast in your body that is a part of your microbiome that can then also get out of control and cause infections like thrush. But those are things that are just sort of most familiar, probably.
Would it be fair to say that the thallus of a fungus is analog of like, in other words, it's the part
Usually the part of the fungus that we see is actually the reproductive structure, which is not the thallus. The thallus is the vegetative structure. That doesn't mean that we don't ever see the vegetative structure, or that we can't find it if we go looking for it, but it's kind of like you can find the roots to a tree or the roots of a plant if you go looking for them as well. The thallus tends to be growing in a medium, so either underground or in the surface of a log or something that's being decomposed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you see that is referred to as green stain is actually the vegetative portion of the body, and then it actually will pop little tiny reproductive mushrooms if you're there at the right time of year. Yep. And then this is sort of our typical fungal cell. So some things that are maybe more analogous to a plant is the presence of the cell wall and the presence of a vacuole, but then more similar to an animal and how it eats. Okay, so it's its own thing, right? You'll notice that there are all of our familiar organelles, the mitochondria, Golgi body, endoplasmic reticulum infolding from the plasma membrane, the nucleus and nucleolus over here to the side, pushed to the edge by the vacuole, much as you find them in plants. Okay, so we use the term thallus for the vegetative body of the plant. The vegetative fungal body is made up of a structure known as hyphae. And hyphae are these thread-like filaments that are one cell thick. So they're these long thread-like strands, and each one of them is 1 cell thick, and they grow in long chains of single cells, and they can branch and split kind of like a root of a plant, but those branches and splits are all still only 1 cell thick. So over here, this image is showing us a diagram of some hyphae. And so you'll notice each one of these blue units is a single cell. And often the cells of this hyphae are directly connected through a little septum between the cells. So much like plasmodesmata and plants provide a direct connection so that the cytoplasm can communicate without having to get through the cell wall barrier, our fungal cells often have a little channel between cells. But this long thread is all 1 cell thick, and then these cells are connected via those channels. Okay. This is a scanning electron micrograph showing you the overlapping threads of those single strands. And those thickened regions you can see are typically places where multiple strands are kind of growing on top of each other or crossing, creating a thickened section. Okay. What we see with our naked eye when we see these hyphae-like structures of fungus is actually the mycelium. And the mycelium, there should be another, there we go. The mycelium is just an interwoven mass of branching hyphae. And so the hyphae themselves, because they're only 1 cell thick, are too small for us to see with our naked eye without the aid of magnification. So what we see that looks like the hyphae are actually the mycelium, which are just many, many, many hyphae interwoven on top of each other and kind of creating the vegetative body. So if you break the bark off of a rotten log and you see this white filamenty like structure underneath it, that's the vegetative portion of a fungus that's helping to decompose that log. Probably most of you have done that at some point in time, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how fungus feed. And so I mentioned that they're absorptive feeders. This means that their digestion occurs external to that vegetative body, and then the pre-digested molecules are absorbed into the hyphae. And so the fungal body, all of those individual feeding cells that are part of the hyphae that make up the mycelium are going to be excreting enzymes. And so we refer to those as exoenzymes, exo to the outside, exit, right? So they're going to excrete those enzymes outside of their body, and those digestive enzymes are going to decompose the materials around them. And then as the decomposing macromolecules break down, the smaller molecules are able to be absorbed directly by the cells as component pieces. Okay. They don't necessarily eat everything that they break down because they're always exuding these enzymes. They're actually able to do a lot of release of nutrients into the environment, and then they consume what they need, but the extra digested materials are then returning those monomers back to the soil where plants can pick them up, where other organisms can absorb them and use them. And so they play a really pivotal role in the ecosystem because of that service. I guess I should explain this bread picture. The reason I have the bread picture here is because we always sort of think like, oh, I don't see anything, it must be fine, right? I feel like that's the falsity with fungus. But we eat fungus anyway, so like, you know, that's maybe bread mold isn't that terrible. You wouldn't want to eat a lot of it. But if we have a piece of moldy bread here, when you actually see these spots on the surface of a piece of moldy bread, you're actually seeing the reproductive structures of that bread mold. And so it's already infiltrated the bread, it's mycelium or breaking down the bread, and then it's actually releasing spores. And so what you're seeing on the surface of those spore producing structures, you're not seeing all of the vegetative growth that's inside that piece of bread or inside that rotting log, or whatever it is that the fungus is inhabiting. Okay. So we say that fungus are saprophytic. I don't think we've really used that word before. in this class, maybe into just briefly talking about the Indian pipes earlier this week. But something that is saprophytic feeds on dead or decaying matter. And so the vast majority of our fungus are all decomposers. They're going to be digesting things that are already dead and that are already starting to decay, and they're just going to help expedite that process. Okay. One of the things that's really essential in terms of from an ecosystem sense is that these enzymes that the fungus excrete can break down cellulose and lignin. And so when you think about things that most animals can't break down, cellulose is really high on that list, right? Unless you have like termites with special gut bacteria, the fermentation vats and rumens, like you have to have a pretty specialized system to have an organism in the animal world that's able to break down cellulose. But fungus can break down cellulose, can also break down lignin. So it's one of the few things that can really decompose wood and actually return all of those nutrients to the soil. So here is again taking the bark off of the surface of a rotting log, and you can see all of the mycelium here. And here is some fungal bodies penetrating the surface of a log. They're really freeing those nutrients back up to the ecosystem. That doesn't mean that all fungus are decomposers. A fairly decent group of fungus function as parasites. And so parasitic fungi obtain their nutrients at the expense of the host. And so over here, we see corn that has been infested with corn smut. And this is a fungus that gets into the corn and reduces crop yields. We have a lot of problems with invasive fungus right now. Humans have served as a profound dispersal agent to move fungus around the world, introducing it to places where organisms have never encountered it before. And then we have these invasive funguses, which plants just can't combat. And so there are a number of trees, beech, chestnut, and others that are experiencing huge declines due to invasive fungus. We also have the spread of some fungus in the chytrid group that are decimating amphibian populations worldwide because they're being moved to organisms that have never encountered them before. And the reason we bleached all our boots when we came back from Masson Ridge is just in case. We don't want to move anything between locations because those fungal spores travel really easily on our clothing and on our bodies. These two insects here, this one and this one, are infected with a parasitic fungus, and the fungus is actually decomposing the organism. In the case of this guy down here, this is something that's a familiar story to a lot of people. It's infected with a fungus known as cordyceps, and it makes zombie insects. It basically turns them into creatures that want to get to a place that promotes dispersal of the fungus. And so they change their behavior as they're being infected with that fungus to better promote fungal life at the expense of the life of the arthropod. And then there are many fungal funguses that can parasitize humans. This is athlete's foot. It's just one of them. There are a number of different fungal infections, usually topical. Humans tend to get topical fungal infections. We have fungus in our body as part of our microbiome, but usually when it outbursts, it's in a topical scenario. Not always, but typically. Okay. And then one of my favorite creepy, weird examples of underground fungus world is that some fungus actually function as predators. And that's kind of cool to think about that. Something that grows sort of vegetatively and digests things externally can also be a predator. How does it catch its prey, right? So there's a group of fungus that are known as nematode stranglers, and they have modified hyphae that can actually sense the movement of nematodes in the environment. Nematodes, if you remember, are roundworms. They are everywhere. They're prolific in soils. And so the fungus encounter the nematodes, and when they feel them, the modified hyphae respond by rushing water into the hyphae and causing it to swell. And in doing so, the hyphae strangles or surrounds the nematode, ultimately killing it. And then there are these other specialized hyphae known as Haustoria here that actually penetrate into the nematode's body and release the exoenzymes into the nematode's body so it starts to decompose, and then they absorb the molecules just like they would if they were breaking down anything else. So the digestion process is pretty analogous to what all fungus do, but the ability to strangle and then also have penetrative hyphae is pretty unique to this group of organisms known as nematode stranglers. Oyster mushrooms do that? But some species do? Wow. Cool fun fact. I didn't know they were in our backyard. Are you like, yeah, where does fungus fall in the vegetarian vegan world? That's a well, I'm just like, that's fascinating. It's an interesting conversation. Yeah, to have. Is it? Are plants sentient? Ah! Sorry, I'm just messing with you. All questions we should be asking ourselves. If we're asking any of the questions, we should ask them all. Okay. So let's look a little bit, very superficially, at the freaky reproductive life of fungus, because they have some pretty fascinating reproduction. So by and large, most fungi are going to reproduce asexually. As a default point, we just reproduce asexually. That can happen in many species due to fragmentation. So a little bit of mycelium breaks off and it goes somewhere else and it just vegetatively grows, right? And so just like many of our organisms we've talked about so far, you can have fragmentation as a source of asexual reproduction, making a clone. You also have budding. And so the yeasts that are shown in this image here are budding. And so here's our parent yeast cell, and just the nucleus is shown here, not the vacuole, in order to keep the image a little bit cleaner. And this yeast cell starts to form a little bud. And you can see this yeast cell here is forming a little bud. And that bud sort of grows off the edge of the yeast cell. And as it's growing, a piece of the nucleus is stretched and pinched into that bud containing genetic material, replicated genetic material. And then the cytoplasm divides, and we have a new yeast cell here. And they tend to make like a chain of buds off of the edge of the yeast cell, so they actually reproduce many offspring kind of in short succession and make this little chain. And then those small daughter cells will undergo a period of growth until they reach the adult size. They start off smaller and then they grow. So scanning electron micrograph, there's several yeast in various states of budding, and then we can actually see the scars where recent buds have broken off and the cell wall has not fully regained its original appearance yet. Okay. And then we have the asexual reproduction via spores. And so many of our fungus are going to have a sort of background asexual reproduction via spores. And so here we have our mass of mycelium, and those mycelium are haploid. Okay? So that dominant vegetative state that you're going to see is a haploid organism, like many of our plants. And that haploid organism is going to produce a spore-producing structure. In many cases, this is what we see as the mushroom, the above-ground reproductive structure, the fruiting body. And that spore-reproducing structure is going to produce spores via mitosis. Okay? So through mitotic processes, it's going to produce little identical genetic components that are packaged in spores. Unlike plant spores, although plant spores are pretty small, fungal spores are even smaller, more lightweight, and easier to transport. And those spores will then go out into the world and land somewhere. And they undergo a period of growth known as germination, which is not the same as germination in a seed, but analogous. They nestle down, they begin to grow, and then they grow into a new mycelium. And so we can have vegetative reproduction through fragmentation. We can have the spore reproduction where we're making a clone. And then we have budding mostly in our single-celled species. Okay. There we go. Was that just one? It was. If I click on this, will my video open? Maybe. So the spores are haploid cells that give rise to new individuals, right? They're tiny, they're very mobile. These are spore-producing structures here, and then when this little dark cap dries, very much like the spore-producing structures of our moss, that little capsule will pop open and spores will come out. This is an earth star, similar to it's a type of puffball mushroom, and those actually give off their spores when water hits the surface. The spores poof up from it. I think I'm actually going to remind me. I'll just do this little bit of lecture and we'll watch this video because the video is not just about mushrooms. It's kind of a nice little wrap up. Just some really nice photography I wanted to share with you. So let's come back to that after I've turned off the stupid headset thing. Okay. Then reproduction can also be sexual. And for sexual reproduction to happen in fungus, we have to have two different mating types. And those different mating types may be members of the same individual. And that individual has both mating types, individual. And it may also be two separate individuals, each having a unique mating type. Sometimes the mating types are referred to as plus and minus mating types. Those alternative mating types have to come together. And what happens is these mating types are represented by different types of mycelium. When the mycelium come into contact, they actually fuse. And so the cells themselves will fuse and share cytoplasm, and then the nucleus themselves will fuse and share genetic information. And that's going to form a diploid organism. And so we'll call that diploid organism a zygote, just like in all of our other organisms. And that diploid organism will then undergo meiosis in order to produce a spore-producing structure that's going to give off haploid spores. Okay. This usually happens in response to environmental changes or unpredictability in the environment, where recombining genetic information might confer an evolutionary advantage. Many of these, so we see this arrow from asexual reproduction can come over here, and we all kind of come back to this mycelium, right? Many of the fungus can take either path depending on the environmental conditions surrounding it, or time of year, other cues. This is a very generalized, very generalized sexual reproduction cycle. I have embedded in the notes that I put on the website, section 2 of this chapter, the different groups, where I have listed out some characteristics of the groups, and then I have put in some very nice diagrams of the reproductive cycles of those different groups. There are subtle differences, and they're pretty interesting to look at, but I'm not going to test you on any of that information. So I put it there for your reference if you want to do a little bit of additional reading, if you want to look at those, if you're really interested in fungus. I gave you some extra resources, but I'm not going to ask you about those details. Okay. So, but I will show you a little bit about what happens when those mating types fuse. And so here we have our hyphae of our two different mating types. So this is our minus mating type, and this is our plus mating type over here. And hyphae are growing along, and they come into contact with each other, and they touch. And when those little branches of hyphae touch, the tips develop into something known as the gametangia, like we talked about in plants, structures that produce gametes. And so those tips are going to develop into this new structure, and they're going to produce the gametes that are going to fuse and ultimately produce the zygote, which is then going to turn into a spore-producing structure, zygospore. The zygote and the zygospore are both diploid, and they're going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. Okay. Depending on the type of mushroom you're looking at, sometimes the hyphae fuse, and then they continue to reproduce and make all, like they have their plus type and their minus type nuclei. They just keep reproducing new nuclei, and then those are ultimately gonna fuse and produce multiple zygospores. It's really interesting. There's lots of different things that happen, and there's sort of two steps. There's the fusion of the haploid cells of the cytoplasm, which is known as plasmogamy. And then there's the karyogamy, which is the fusion of the haploid nuclei. And sometimes the nuclei fuse before the cells completely finish fusing. Other times the cells fuse first, and then there's divisions that occur before the nuclei actually join together. And so the timing of these two steps varies greatly depending on the type of fungus that you're looking at. Okay. And presumably that has advantages for how that particular organism grows and reproduces. Okay. And then I keep alluding to this when you see a mushroom, or you see, in the case of our bread mold, you don't see a mushroom on the bread mold, but you see that fuzzy surface, right? Anytime you see the fruiting body of the vegetative phallus, that is the reproductive structure. And so in the case of our sort of very traditional looking mushroom here, we have underground all of this mycelium that is branching and interwoven and feeding off of the decomposition in this organic matter in the soil. And when it's ready to reproduce, it is going to make this reproductive structure, the mushroom, which is also composed entirely of hyphae. Right? And then the tips of the hyphae in the reproductive structure have these special spore-producing structures at the very tips. And that's going to be where the spores are released from. Mm-hmm. Yep, in a big mass. Well, they overlap with each other and their walls connect. I mean, they form their own structure by lignified cell walls supporting each other, but not lignified, chitinized cell walls providing structure for each other. But yeah, there's not like a skeleton to the mushroom or anything. Okay. So we've got our basic understanding of what a mushroom is, and I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the ecology of fungus because they're so essential to a healthy functioning ecosystem. I've already alluded to this and mentioned this in talking about their feeding. They're essential decomposers, right? When we think about the things that eat dead and decaying matter, we don't think of it as being a glorious job in the ecosystem, right? We often give scavengers in the animal world kind of a bad rap, right? Like, oh, they're gross, they're just eating dead stuff. But somebody has to eat the dead stuff, or else the world would be full of dead stuff, right? The world would be littered with decomposing bodies of other organisms. And really, the fungus are huge, huge service in the ecosystem of breaking down those decomposing materials and freeing up those nutrients to go back into the ecosystem, back into the cycle. And so here are some fungus breaking down a tree stump, and this fecal pile is full of fungus that's fruiting with this mushroom, and it's decomposing that waste matter. Okay, so dead and decaying bodies, and then decomposing waste. Okay, they're freeing up all those nutrients and returning them to the environment. They also play an essential role in helping other species through symbiotic relationships. And so probably the one you hear of the most in thinking about plant growth and reproduction is the presence of what's known as mycorrhiza. And the word mycorrhiza means fungus, myco referring to the fungus, and the rhizo part referring to root. And so mycorrhiza are fungus roots. And it's a symbiotic association between fungus and plant roots. And many species of both fungus and plants participate in these symbiotic associations. We're just lumping them all together into the mycorrhizoformers. Depending on the plant and the type of association that occurs, the fungus invades the plant root either by burying into the tissue between the cells, into the intercellular space, or by actually burying into the cell itself. Okay? And most plants sort of have a kind of a boundary, like they have this outer layer of the root that they will allow fungus to penetrate, and then they try to prevent the fungus from coming in any further than that boundary. Okay? So some portion of the outer surface of the root is going to actually be embedded with fungus. And in this symbiotic relationship, the plant is going to be giving nutrients to the fungus. So the plant is offloading excess sugars, and the fungus is taking some of those resources. The fungus is going to be providing a ready supply of nutrients, both directly through the connection to the cells and by producing lots of nutrients through its external digestion in the immediate vicinity of those roots. Right? The fungus also helps to bring in more water. And so essentially by having this association, if you look, here's a little seedling with its naked roots. Here's the same seedling if it has mycorrhizal associations. And so the surface area of soil that you can tap into for nutrient resources and water is hugely amplified if you have that fungal association. And there's lots of fascinating research going on now about how these fungal associations actually provide underground networks where individual trees and plants can actually communicate with each other through the fungus. They can actually share resources through the fungus. They may send signals about insect or disease invasions that are happening, so as to warn other individuals and help them to get their immune systems ready before the attack comes. There's all sorts of fascinating other things that are happening in addition to this like direct association that we can visually see and observe and measure. That is an area of a lot of research right now, where forest biologists and mycologists are working together to try to put together that story. I think the story is far from complete at this point. I should have put this slide first because we were talking about this symbiotic relationship. The word symbiosis means living inside together. And so if you think about that word, it just means that things that are living in direct contact with another species. I think colloquially, we all use the term symbiosis to mean something positive, like the organisms are benefiting. But technically, this parasite in which this arthropod is infested with cordyceps fungus is also a symbiotic relationship because the fungus is living inside together in the arthropod's body or arthropod's body. So that term, its root words are maybe different than how we use it colloquially. So when we want to talk about a symbiotic relationship in which all of the members of the relationship are benefiting, specific term for that is mutualism. So in our mycorrhizal situation, the plant and the fungus have a mutualistic relationship in which both members are benefiting from that interaction. Another example of a mutualistic relationship are lichens, and this picture here is of some lichen. And lichen is just an association of fungus and either green algae or cyanobacteria, or in some cases both. Okay. So in this particular diagram, we have the vegetative body, fungal hyphae, attaching through specialized hyphae to some sort of structure, leaf, a branch, a log, whatever it is it's attaching to. And then the hyphae form this interwoven mass with algae or cyanobacteria suspended within the mass. And so the bulk of the lichen is actually hyphae. Like the majority of the lichen is fungal body, vegetative fungal body. But then we also have these algae or cyanobacteria cells that are embedded within that hyphae. And so here the algae cells are carrying out photosynthesis, just like the association with the plant. They're providing photosynthesis products for the fungus. The fungus is providing an environment that provides the algae with a safe place to be. It provides a moist environment for preventing desiccation, and it's also breaking down materials and providing free nutrients to the algae cells. When you are in a damp forest, like we are here in New England, like you are in the Pacific Northwest, lichen are super abundant. When you move into even a slightly drier forest, you really notice the decline in lichen. So if you're driving along the California coast and you kind of head out of the central and northern Sierras and you start to head up into Pacific Northwest territory, like you feel the shift in lichen availability. Just like you do if you drive from here to the Midwest, you feel the decline in lichen abundance in the forest. It's definitely an association of moist forests. Lichens also grow not just in the forest canopy and on trees, but they can grow on rocks. And lichens are the first species to move in to a denuded area. So I don't know if any of you guys, I just posted on Facebook yesterday this fantastic video of lava flowing into the ocean. And you like see this red molten flow of lava coming into the ocean, and steam is going everywhere, and black chunks of rock are spitting up out of the ocean, right? The island, the big island in Hawaii, is getting bigger right now, right? It's growing. Rock is being deposited, and as that steam cools, that molten lava rock is forming on the edge. And when all of this activity that's going on right now is done, then things are going to have to move out to that bare naked rock. And one of the first things to move out and start to create soil on bare rock is lichen. And so this rock here is absolutely covered with like at least 3 different types of species. There's 3 different types of lichen: the black lichen, the dark green lichen, and the light green lichen, right? And all of those are particle by particle chipping the surface of that rock away and freeing those minerals to become part of the new soil layer. Right? And so lichen are the sort of the first species to really begin to convert solid rock after a glacier or after a volcano into soil, where we can start to accumulate organic material and begin to provide a substrate for everything else to grow on. Lichen come in sort of 3 different varieties, and the species definition of lichen is always very, very intangible to me, because we actually have one species of algae or cyanobacteria and another species of fungus forming this association. And so there are people who get really into the understanding the fine details of lichen. Most people just sort of talk about lichens by their growth form. And so this growth form that's shown here is the crustose form of lichen. It's the crusty lichen. It's what forms the fine, crusty growth. And I know that I talk about the desert way too much, but if any of you ever find yourself in the deserts of the Intermountain or Southwest North America, there are these really amazing crusts in the soil known as cryptogamic crust. And it's actually these hundreds of years old relationships between lichen and soil that provide structure against erosion in a place where there's almost no vegetation, and otherwise the soil would move constantly. And so you have these little associations, and they look like this. This is some association of soil crusts. The rest of these are sort of crust growing on rock, and they have a little bit of a piece of bark here just covered in tiny little crusty lichen growths. Then some lichens form a growth pattern that's known as shrubby or fruticose. And so these are reindeer lichen, a type of reindeer lichen. You'll find these in the New England forest. They're also known as reindeer lichen because they are prolific in the tundra, and during certain seasons are how the reindeer sustain themselves. They literally lick the lichen off of the rock, and that's their primary food source. These guys are also friends you might be familiar with in the New England forest. Very shrubby and kind of bushy looking growth forms. You'll find them sort of hanging from branches or suspended in the canopy. And then the third growth form is foliose, which means leaf-like. And this forms a leaf-like mat. And this one here is actually fruiting. This one, these two are probably very similar species. These are really common around here. You'll just see one of those leaf-like green structures on the bark of a tree. And when we found our little tree frog last week underneath the cover boards, his body is designed to match those foliose lichens on a light bark, that greenish pale sort of lichen on log color. Okay, so that's all I have for fungus. I know we all have lots of questions about fungus. Does anybody have any that I might be able to answer? Not being a fungus expert. Fee?
In regard to the lake theory,